Welcome to the last panel of the day, often the most difficult to show up for, so thanks for coming. I'm delighted to be here, especially grateful to Luigi for inviting me to moderate this panel. My name is Sohrab Amari, and I'm one of the founding editors of a magazine called Compact, a relatively newish online magazine, and I am especially embarrassed to say this in a setting like this with so many former kind of DOJ antitrust officials in the room, that Compact has a monopoly on heterodox thought from left and right, aimed at pushing us beyond the neoliberal model and toward a new center built around kind of social democratic renewal and the common good. And in all seriousness, in a way, in talking about these terms, and especially kind of the buzzword of the moment of post-neoliberalism, we feel like we're at Compact. We feel like we're pushing on a half-open door as far as that goes. In my reading or our reading, elites on both sides of the Atlantic, on the center left and center right, had really taken to heart / been terrified by the populist uprisings that swept both Europe and the United States beginning in the mid-2010s. And so they're even as they ferociously combat populists at the ballot box, sometimes in the courts, they're also kind of taking on that critique and seeking to give policy voice to it. So when you have, for example, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, talking about the failure of the Washington consensus, which is another byword for neoliberalism, when you have the Biden administration keeping in place all of the tariffs that the Trump administration put in place, when you have the kind of industrial strategy elements of the Biden administration in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, and of course the entire kind of worldview centered around decoupling or de-risking, as they call it in Europe. When you have Financial Times columnists sounding like anti-globalization activists from Seattle circa 1998, you know there's something in the water. And all of this, from my point of view, is welcome. But the reason we're gathered here at this panel is to ask, what role does antitrust play in all of this? Yes, Lynn especially is perhaps the most visible embodiment of this post-neoliberal dispensation today, but is antitrust really where the action is or should be in this work of reform? Is antitrust vigilance perhaps at odds with a spirit of industrial policy and national developmentalism, where we do want to pick favorites and make bets on our favorites? Are we on the cusp of a kind of new flowering of anti-monopoly activism, or is this actually the beginning of the end of the ferment? So, luckily, I don't have to answer any of those. I'd love being at a panel where I'm actually just the moderator, but we do have an incredible panel to explore these and other themes. It might be the least charts and graphs-oriented discussion today, and the most kind of free-flowing. I hope you're up for that. But we have really kind of these all-star figures in the antitrust space, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're seated and in the order in which they will speak. They'll each go for about 7 to 10 minutes. Then I will exercise my moderator's privilege to ask questions from the panel for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a wider discretion to Q&A. So to my immediate left is Zephyr Teachout. She's an associate professor of law at Fordham.
Still professor.
Professor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Many years now, but maybe I'm at the beginning of the end of my associate professor.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Very good. Very good. I'm sorry. I was like looking at Wikipedia. Sorry. Don't trust Wikipedia. And in the past, among many, many other roles, she served as a special advisor and special counsel in the Attorney General's Office for Economic Justice in New York State, where I live as well. Then to Zephyr's left is Barry Lynn, who's the executive director of the Open Markets Institute, followed by Matt Stoller, who's the director of research for the American Economic Liberties, project, the author of Goliath, the 100-Year War Between Monopoly Power and Democracy, and perhaps almost certainly the most important thing he does is he's an occasional contributor to compactmag.com. And last but not least, offering a European perspective is Cristina Caffarra, who's the co-founder of the Competition Research Policy Network based out of the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to the panelists for their opening statements, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for a fantastic, as always, conference. I really appreciated the panels today. And so what I'm going to mostly do is situate where I think we are in this moment in terms of the antitrust project in the U.S. And the panels today were very useful in setting that up because we had a series of history panels, which is a sort of very powerful way to think about the shift, which is mostly what I want to talk about, from antitrust being an insular domain of economics to moving into the domains of law, politics, industrial policy, and history. And that shift of domain, I think we can talk about the particular standards, but is arguably the most significant shift, and I think will be hard to roll back. So if we think about to maybe 10 years ago, but even 5 years ago, antitrust, the field is dominated by economics, by the language of economics. There's a strong in-group vernacular. It's insular. It's largely ahistorical, focused on modeling more than history. It aggressively excludes considerations of power and politics. It is separate from the policy debate, and there are largely understood to be two major enforcers along with the private bar. So in the last 4 years, you've seen this radical change in understanding of what the purposes of antitrust are, from efficiency to a plural understanding, including, among other things, a concern about political power, domination. You've seen significant increased enforcement, rulemaking, a move towards prophylactic rules, and a significant shift towards the consideration of monopsony and, in particular, workers in the field. So as this has happened, I want to talk about the domain shifts, which I think are really critical. The first is the shift to the domain of law. And this has really been led by the key antitrust enforcers, by Biden's DOJ and by Chair Khan and the FTC. But it is a shift to the language of law, the vernacular of law, the rule of law principles as central organizing principles. Just as a quick reminder, I come from anti-corruption law, and in general, when we do anti-corruption law, somebody who is subject, say, to a bribery charge cannot offer pro-democracy evidence of pro-democracy effects as a defense. There has always been something extremely peculiar, as Eric talked about in the merger guidelines piece, peculiar in the fit between the lingua franca of law and the rule of law and the consumer welfare standard and the sort of accompanying suites of methods that really dominated the field. You see and just as a quick aside, on my way here, I took my Apple laptop from my TSA, and it was not my Apple laptop. So he is very fortunate because he opened it up and it says Zephyr Teachout. He can find me, right? The laptop I have is John Davidson's laptop. So hopefully he'll find me, but in the meantime, I'm reading off of my phone, so forgive me. Okay. So I just want to use I do think these merger guidelines were a really critical moment in the shift, in the domain shift of antitrust. Because the new guidelines first started with the text of the Clayton Act, and they start with the text of the statute. That is law-like behavior to look at statutory text. And the repeated use, 84 times, lessen competition, language, textual language is in the guidelines, substantial difference from the prior use of the guidelines. So you have the reintroduction of law in that way. And second, as was much debated, the reintroduction of case law and the introduction of case law. Basically, the guidelines came with their best attire on, as if to court, wearing case law instead of wearing economic theory as the core justificatory theory. So it's moving to the world of law. The guidelines sort of focused on the importance of having comprehensible, simple, administrable, clear rules as an aspiration, the rule of law principles, general rule of law principles. The focus on not arbitrarily limiting kinds of evidence that can be used. That's also in the guidelines, and that's also law-like, unlike sort of the sphere of relevant information that lies if you are in the domain of economics. Relatedly, removing other arbitrary limits like vertical and horizontal sort of limits on the language we can use in talking about it. And there's a few other moves. I think the most important law-like move, and the essential nature of law is that it is prophylactic. That's true whether it is a malum prohibitum or malum in se. All law, by definition, by being law, the nature of the rule of law is that there's a prophylactic element to it. That is sort of embedded in the concept of equal application and legibility. Those are actually aspects of law, not just aspects of antitrust. You see this really significant linguistic shift in the guidelines as representing this domain shift from economics. In this room, it's not that the insular or not so insular, as many of the people here, economic antitrust community dissolved. It's coexisting with this new domain, and there's still, real tension there. But the shift to making law the dominant language of enforcers is really significant. Other shifts in the domain are shifts in pedagogy. And it matters that there is, real excitement among law students around antitrust issues. A shift, I don't know if Elettra's here now, but I was asking her and others, do you teach an upper-level antitrust and democracy course? And the response was, I teach an antitrust course, and I wouldn't want to separate that as a separate from antitrust and democracy. So the pedagogical shift and an understanding, and that matters too, and creates accessibility even for those who don't have economic training, because once the language of law, Clayton Act, is used, that actually opens accessibilities for those within the legal profession, even if they don't have economic training. And you're seeing that pedagogical shift. So again, that moves to step 2, which is also at the same time and not arbitrarily moves into the domain of politics. We see that not only in the, and I refer here to Luigi and Filippo's great article on the political economy of the pre-resurgence. One of the things they note in their article is the vanishing, sort of the great vanishing of antitrust monopoly as having political assailants on the part of campaigns, candidates. It just sort of disappears. And they have a really interesting story about that. So what is happening at this moment of reappearance? You're seeing not only more hearings than you've seen, we wish more would happen with those hearings, and a fair amount of federal efforts so far unsuccessful. But also, really importantly, hundreds, if you include all the non-compete and junk fees and other pieces of legislation moving into state legislatures. And that is muscle building even when there is a failure. It is moving antitrust in the domain of politics and law at the same time. So when we were pushing a domination bill in the New York Senate, the first response was one of absolute bewilderment. There's a total inability, a lack of a muscle, of a way to analyze it, even a way to ask questions of it. But those state senators who have yet to pass that law have then built over the last couple of years an understanding of a muscle of the kinds of tools that can be used. And those tools then get applied and deployed in other contexts. Or I have people asking, lawmakers asking about what can we do with antitrust in the worker context. So there's this really significant change in moving it into the sphere of politics. And just to be clear, in the sphere of politics and the sphere of law, by necessity, these are highly contested spheres, and they're going to be highly contested spheres. That's actually their nature. They're fundamentally public. So there can be wins and losses within those spheres. But I don't think, where am I on time?
Almost there.
Okay. I don't think you can move it back out easily. Like you can lose within those realms funding for the DOJ. And part of the reason it's going to be hard to move it back out of the sphere of law and out of this the domain of law and out of the domain of politics is that even as Luigi and Filippo show, it wasn't like there was a big move to defang antitrust enforcers in 1980. There weren't rallies in the street, more mergers. Right? There was still a superficial, and has continued to be a superficial gloss on why that was credible and why that was plausible. And after Citizens United and the rise of corporate spending in politics and the changing understanding of corporate power in politics on the one hand, and on the second hand, the COVID pandemic, the Russian invasion, and the accompanying price spikes, including price spikes that were, as Weber and others have shown, driven in part by corporate power, it is simply not credible to claim, A, that there is not a power valence, political power valence to economic power, or two, that an insular economic domain-driven community can protect you against high prices. And since those are the sort of two key pillars of now I'm getting to the substance of the shift, not just the domain of the shift. But since those were the two key pillars of sort of justification, like we don't want to engage in questions of power and price and price and price or quality, or you can consumer welfare under the demand curve, that has failed in a public way. I don't think you are going to successfully, you can again see underfunding and see losses, but remove these questions from that domain.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you all. The prompt on this conversation was, is this the end of the beginning? And, which was, I took as a bit of a softball. For me, the first time it was the end of the beginning was when I put my first article to bed on this issue in 2002, which is the cover of Harper's. And I, cannot tell you how happy I was at that moment, or thinking about, end of the beginning was putting the bed cornered 2009. Or I think about Zephyr's campaign and Tim's campaign in 2014, which was the end of the beginning. I think about Elizabeth Warren's speech in June 29th, 2016. That was the end of the beginning. I think about Matt's article in the Atlantic, in November of 2016. That was the end of the beginning. The Stigler 1 conference, Trump and Cambridge Analytica, the Cicilline Commission, Cristina and Tommaso, we hosted them in a conversation in 2022 in October in Brussels, and in some parts, famously, Cristina, and then was echoed by Tommaso, said that antitrust economics is snake oil. And I thought that was the end of the beginning. But, you know, obviously the big leap forward was when, with Biden's executive order in 2021, which Tim had a pretty major hand in. And, you know, but I thought, you know, it's one thing is, you know, I hope that we understand that once again we are at the end of the beginning, but we should also understand that we're still very much at the beginning. You know, ideally, you know, 10 years from now, we'll still be at the beginning, because as soon as we stop pushing, we become the target, we become sclerotic, we stop thinking, you know. So anyway, just, yeah, it's the end of the beginning, but I just keep, you know, I hope we're always there. You know, so, well, you know, when I'm thinking about, like, you know, how to sort of look forward, you know, 4 years from now, what I'd like to be able to do is, with you in this room, kind of look back and sort of see some other advances that we've made. You know, one of the things that we didn't talk about that much today, I mean, actually, Saurabh brought this up, you know, Jake Sullivan's speech last April was phenomenal. Everybody in this room who has not read that speech has to read that speech. Catherine Tye's speech last June 15th, absolutely phenomenal. It was probably the best document on antitrust written this year. It was Catherine Tye, the trade representative of the United States. You know, if you haven't read it, you're not doing antitrust. You're not doing antimonopoly. So, you know, reconnecting what we are doing antitrust in this room to antimonopoly more broadly, to competition more broadly, to trade policy, to industrial policy. I mean, the IRA, that was one of the great anti-monopoly actions by Congress of all time. People said Congress ain't done nothing. But you know what Congress did? They used money to break choke points. That's anti-monopoly. You know, so we really have to figure out how to broaden this conversation. Earlier today, we you know, there was that comment about antitrust being, you know, something in which is elites fighting elites. Yeah, it's to some extent that's been the way it has been in certain parts of this history. You know, I think 4 years from now, it would be, you know, if we can look back and actually say we have actually re-democratized anti-monopoly so that once again it is democratic in nature. Once again, it is for the farmer, it is for the independent business, it is for the independent person. We can do that in 4 years. I think we will do that. I think, you know, given who's in office, we'll look back and we'll realize that we actually have re-democratized anti-monopoly for little people, for regular people. You know, I think 4 years from now, you know, we've been looking at this for 30, 40 years as a science of efficiency. A lot of people still look at it as a science of efficiency. This is engineering. Anti-monopoly is engineering. You know, we had this big conversation last year about bright line rules, you know, which is also known as rule of law. You know, when you're talking about industrial systems, which is what we're talking about, that's engineering. And so we need to be looking at this through a different set of lenses. This is not science, it is engineering. Another thing, hierarchy of harm. We've had so many conversations of everywhere I go, everyone's talking about innovation, AI innovation. Innovation is important. It's fantastically important. But you know what? Democracy is more important. Human liberty is more important. And every single person in this business has to be able to create a hierarchy in their minds and their actions so that when we promote innovation, we're not overthrowing human liberty. We are not overthrowing our democracy. We are not subverting our communities. We are not destroying the minds and souls of our youth. History. We got a historian here. Thank the Lord. But, you know, it's like law is history. It ain't science. Bork said it was science. It is history. You know, in Europe, and we'll hear some more about this from Cristina, nobody understands the history of anti-monopoly in Europe. You know when it started? It didn't start with the Ordo Liberals. It started in 1945 in May after the unconditional surrender of Germany when the Truman administration ordered the breakup of German industry. 1945, an order by the occupying army. Coal and steel, bringing people together to share control over industry. Monet said, because this should always be remembered as the first European antitrust law. Is it today remembered as such? Absolutely not. We need to reconnect with our history. And this is true here in the United States. We're still just at the beginning of relearning non-discrimination, which is the foundation of antitrust, of antimonopoly. It's not break things up. It's taking things that are true monopolies like the state or network, things that you cannot break up, and making them neutral. Non-discrimination. 1624, 400 years ago this year, statute of monopolies, bringing monopolies under the common law so that the king could not willy-nilly create monopolies where he or she wished. Luigi, Guy, I don't know if Guy's here, but Filippo, you guys have created a conversation here that is been of incredible value, not just to the people in this room, but to our society. And we forget how important this conversation is. We forget how important these questions are, these decisions, and I hope everybody in this room, 4 years from now can look back and actually just talk about how some action that you have taken to make the world safer, to make the world more fair, to make the world more just. It is a privilege to be in this conversation. It's an absolute privilege. And everybody here has a responsibility. Even those on the defense side, you can actually help. So anyway, thank you.
So thank you for that was beautiful, lovely, and the last panel of the day too. That was you really dug deep. Appreciate that. So and in the beginning, I think I'm going to start by talking a little bit about how far we've come, and then give sort of an observation about where I think we might need to go. So a couple of years ago, I think it was 2020 or maybe 2021. The game show Jeopardy had as a clue it was a visual clue. It was the seal of the FTC, and no one got it. Yeah. And then I think a couple of weeks ago, Lena Khan was a clue, and multiple people buzzed in, tried to buzz in, and got it right. And it was the public knowing that there's an FTC is a significant change. That's a big deal. There's been changes. The latest one was inhaler prices. There's going to be a vote on non-compete agreements next week. Meat prices have changed potentially because of some of the price fixing, some significant shifts in the airline industry. You're starting to see the effects of a new enforcement regime. One of the most significant actions was to block the NVIDIA ARM merger, which, has led to two extraordinarily successful companies since that merger was blocked, instead of them being bound up in merger and trying to integrate. But, there are significant challenges. So Boeing is still run by accountants, right? If you look at the semiconductor industry, where we've tried to use money to break choke points, the company that's actually trying to make things, high-end fabs is Intel, their stock is doing really badly versus the ones who are fabless. And that, to me, I think, is the core problem right now, which is that we're still focused on a high finance view of the corporation. So we kind of dance between antitrust and anti-monopoly in general. Is antitrust, versus free trade or whatever. Bork didn't think about the world that way. Bork thought about antitrust, and he said, I care about antitrust because it's the tip of the spear for an ideology. That's what he thought. He said, this is going to go everywhere because you're an antitrust lawyer. Then you go and you work at some other agency of government. You bring that with you. And that is true. That was true. And what he changed with him and a bunch of people, including the guy who, the center is named for, they saw antitrust as a form of the changes they were making to antitrust as a form of deregulation. This was on a memo that came out on pro-market. And it was part of an overall ideological transformation that was meant to address some legitimate problems: inflation, breakdown of the New Deal model of public utility rulemaking, fears that U.S. firms couldn't compete with low-cost producers in Asia and Europe. But they made a lot of changes. Changes in IP, trade, labor law, regulatory policy, consumer protection, privacy, merger law, defense base, arbitration agreements. They moved to thinking about efficiency over concentrations of power from citizen to consumer. You saw in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, the copywriting of genetic materials, the copywriting of semiconductor designs, 80s and 90s, the shutting down of public production of weapons, moving control of defense IP from defense contractors from the government to defense contractors, a whole series. It was a massive change. There were some exceptions, the AT&T and Microsoft case, Semitech, but they were exceptions. And the idea was to move to a capital-light model of production. So business moved away from producing things to controlling bottlenecks, IP, monopolization, high finance, and the grubby work of doing things went elsewhere, right? America is going to be a place with media, with high finance, with design. It was part of a strategy. So, one way to see it is that Silicon Valley doesn't use a lot of silicon anymore. It's now the center of the advertising industry, right? So you have companies like Apple and NVIDIA, which are really powerful, but are pretty small, relatively speaking. Although that's just because they control huge swaths of industrial activity via contract. Millions of people work for Apple, but Apple only has 50,000, 100,000 employees, something like that. Okay. So since the end, this sort of started to change ideologically. I think Barry was sort of the pioneer in this in the early 2000s. But toward the end of the Obama administration, you saw the first executive order on competition policy. You saw a few things move. You saw more changes in the Trump administration. But since I think the Biden years, we've seen a reorientation of antitrust. And I should have slides, but I don't on principle. It's really hard to compare. Data on antitrust is terrible, right? It's really hard to compare one administration to another because Live Nation Ticketmaster was a merger challenge, right? The numbers are terrible. So I found a metric that kind of works, which is to look at merger trials. How many times are you willing to pull the trigger and go to trial? It's not a perfect metric. But if you look at that metric, you see that the numbers show that this administration are at the high end of enforcement versus Trump and Obama. So it's 4 merger trials a year under Biden versus 2.5 under Trump, a little over 2 a year under the second Obama term and 1.5 in the first term of Obama. They're very different first and second terms. So the eyeball the trials, the Biden ones are much bigger. They have more politically powerful targets. So the DOJ's second merger trial under Obama was in 2013. It was U.S. versus Bazaar Voice, which was a medium-sized firm that made software for rating and reviewing products. They did some big ones: Anthem, Cigna, Aetna, Humana. Trump did some stuff on AT&T, Time Warner, but Biden is in a different league. It's big companies you've heard of, trillion-dollar firms, Microsoft, Meta, politically powerful corporations, American Airlines, Booz Allen, JetBlue, Illumina, Simon & Schuster, United Health Group. And if you look at by size, I think that's probably the easiest way, quick and dirty, to figure out how difficult the challenge is. There's really no comparison. So in terms of merger trials where you have the acquisition target of over $1 billion, Biden does 2.5 of those a year. Biden did half of such trial a year. The Obama second term did 1 per year, and Obama first term did none per year. So that's a percentage of billion-dollar merger trials as a percentage of all merger trials was 27% for Obama, 20% for Trump, and Biden enforcers are at 58%. So even when you eliminate all the kind of extra work of rules and merger guidelines and restoring Clayton Act Section 3 and yada, yada, privacy and consumer protection, you're seeing there is a significant change. I'm not trying to be critical of previous enforcers. It was just a different era and a different legal and political climate. And I think if you took those same people and you put them into the positions today, they would make different choices. And that is in many ways because of the conversations in this room and elsewhere. Okay, but we still have a long way to go because there isn't a need to integrate antitrust with the rest of the policy suite. As Bork noted, it's an ideology. So even the premise of the first panel was, well, does antitrust really matter, or are these other policy levers really more important? But the antitrust division makes a lot of comments to other agencies. They're not just they don't just bring cases. They are an ideological center of promoting competition. And so we have to think about the problem of competition policy, as anti-monopoly policy more broadly. And I think that we will be, I think we're at the end of the beginning. I don't know, given these metaphors, but when we figured out that the key is to use all policy levers to move away from that strategy in the late 1970s, early 80s, which moved the grubby work of making things elsewhere, and bring that back to the U.S., other places that are sort of near, and have the people who actually do the work, like the people that assemble the planes, have some control over the work. And that's an integrated suite, an ideologically integrated suite of policy levers. We don't yet have a language to talk about it that way, but we're developing it. So that's where I sort of see the next stage of a development for this anti-monopoly movement.
Thank you. Cristina?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me again, Luigi and Filippo. I'll start with the normal disclosure that anyone from with a past career in consulting needs to make. In fact, as I was looking at Alia's slides on the Google case, I realized I worked on every single one of those cases. I'm happy to say on the other side, I was the witness in Russia for Yandex in that case, which has earned me the distinction of being described by some in this country as a Russian agent recently, as well as a Chinese agent. I was involved in multiple cases to do with ATEC in Texas, with the Australian bargaining code, and then I worked adverse to Meta. I have done work for Apple, for Microsoft, and others. With that out of the way, in fact, with Microsoft, John, you mentioned this morning the case. We worked together on the very first case in Europe about 20 years ago, on the side of the Commission at the time. So I want to give you a little perspective on things in Europe. I'm in some sense the odd one out, the interloper in this panel, because, of course, I'm not here, of course, to talk about the progressive movement in the US, but I want to give you a sense of where Europe is in this journey, or on this journey, from what one can describe as neoliberal values, a word that Europeans really hate, in enforcement, to a more political economy view, an anti-monopoly view. And frankly, to just give you the punchline, there is significant resistance in Europe to adopt still this type of development, this shift. The shift has been very apparent here, and the previous speakers have described it. In Europe, I would say we are 5 years behind in this journey, both in terms of the posture and in terms of the language. We certainly do not have that vernacular. It's unfamiliar, and it is not yet developing. And the reality is that we in Europe we veered into a Chicago view of the world, which we describe differently as the more economic approach about 20 years ago. We believe that was a form of revelation. We adopted that as the truth. We were getting rid of extraneous factors. And we embraced this idea of consumer welfare, efficiency as being the one true way to think about it. And of course, we are at pains to say we don't really only care about price. We have a notion of consumer welfare, which is broad. We care about quality, we care about innovation. All of that is true. But the recent change in narrative and language, which is so apparent here, a view in which we no longer focus on the consumer, but we talk about citizens. We talk about a more inclusive vision that essentially here embraces farmers, workers, small businesses, and not just people as consumers is not a shift that has been progressing very far in Europe. There's in fact relatively considerable resistance, apart from a few, to still go on that journey. And this is for a variety of reasons. I mean, in part, there is limited academia on this, limited academic support. The academic world in Europe is enthralled and transfixed by the Digital Markets Act, by regulation that we are effectively developing in digital, and this is the main focus of action. We can talk later about what I think of that, but there's no question that much of the antitrust academic milieu is ultimately one that essentially exercises itself only that corner, which is the DMA. Two, there is no one at the level of civil society, very little, very incipient, pushing aggressively for this vision. I mean, Barry, Matt, others here have been making this kind of discussion real for some years. In Europe, civil society is fragmented, is small, is not coordinated. It hasn't really yet very incipiently adopted the language of antitrust and antimonopoly. The focus has been very much more on digital rights for civil society in Europe. But let's also think about the fact that in principle, when you talk to the European citizen, the language is a little odd. You talk about antimonopoly, but to a European, you say, what do you mean? Is it Deutsche Telekom? Is it Vodafone? Is it Gaz de France? We don't have the 3 meat packers across a vast nation. We don't have the 2 chicken packers. We don't have that reality on the ground. We are a continent of 500 million people fragmented in 27 member states in which we don't have the cross-continent monopolies that you have here. And that's a reality that, of course, colors the language that we can use. Of course, vested interest is a very powerful, and it is true here as it is over there. The entire antitrust bubble is very happy with the way in which regulators really behave in Europe. Things have been pretty steady as she goes. Yes, a few things are blocked. Yes, a few cases are happening, but nothing that we cannot deal with. And in fact, corporate clients talk about the European Commission as the adult in the room when they talk about regulators across the piece, particularly with this current FTC and DOJ. You can talk to the Commission. You can actually make sense of a deal and a solution with them. And then there is a notion that regulators are pretty insulated in their bubble, frankly. I mean, they end up meeting CEOs and lawyers. This notion of democratizing antitrust. Yes, they can say democracy a couple of times, but they don't leave that tower very much. They don't go and actually meet real people and citizens. And so there is this detachment. Frankly, I see little appetite for change and very little ability to diagnose what's before them. So when Lina or Jonathan talk about pinch points in people's experience and say, what is it that is making people's life worse? This is not what European regulators in the main are asking themselves. You know, they're looking at the process of competition. They're dealing with the process of competition. Miraculously, that will make everybody better off. And there is further a great deal of siloing because antitrust is still a fairly siloed discipline, different from trade with whom we do not communicate, different from data protection, different from industrial policy, very distinct. So what is going to change? Just my final comment. Is this going to change and how is it going to change? Well, I think this is actually emphatically not the view of the European Parliament. This is what the Commission is. This is the institutions. The Parliament is much more alert to the predicament that we are in and to the need to actually join dots. And there is dissatisfaction at this performance and the siloing of disciplines. And frankly, we've seen it this week. We had two, and we discussed it this morning briefly in the panel, we had two former Italian prime ministers issuing this week, or at least a preview of a report that each had been tasked to write on internal market and competitiveness, which is, in both cases, extremely stark. It does effectively, both reports point out that Europe is not in a good place. John was describing this morning, and others, various measures, and almost every measure you can think of, Europe is lagging. We have a massive size deficit of firms. We have factor productivity, which is behind. And so there is, at this point, a realization at the beginning, 5 weeks from an election, that Europe is in a hard position. And so there is a big call for industrial policy, which also includes calls for consolidation, growth, size. We need to allow firms to become bigger, because in Europe we are too small to compete on the stage. So there is going to be a need for competition regulators to come out and play, because antitrust as usual, business as usual, is not feasible anymore. I don't think it is. It cannot be feasible. We cannot be sitting there and say, we do it just right. You know, when the pendulum swings, I want to be in the middle. No major change needed. This is the kind of narrative. Well, you know, the train is coming down the track very fast. We have a massive problem in terms of the economy. DMA is not going to put points on GDP. We can talk about it later. So where next? I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Please join me in giving the panelists a round of applause for this questions. So we are technically supposed to end at 5:35. So I will pose one question to each panelist in hopes that they'll keep the remarks fairly compact, so we can have a good amount of, maybe 20 minutes for the kind of group, the public Q&A. So with Zephyr, I really appreciated how you framed antitrust as part of a broader effort to assert the primacy of law and politics over markets. The question I had is, at the end of the day, though, antitrust action takes the form of litigation, typically, or regulation, in which it's experts marshaling kind of pricing models and so on and so forth. In other words, it doesn't look like the kind of public contestation that we're used to when we think about, for example, the New Deal order, right? In the form of, consumer co-ops and labor unions and so on, and kind of political bargaining between different social classes. It's still kind of an expert regulatory / judge-driven affair. So is that a shortcoming of the antitrust model for reform?
I think I just, setting aside what you were comparing it to in terms of contestation, I'm going to object to your characterization. So, yes, there are some, all law, most law has experts. In a med-mal case, there are experts, and those experts matter. They're not trivial. But the fundamental legal question is, what is reasonable care for a doctor in this particular industry? So that's a key contestation with the presence of experts, but in a secondary role. Experts not defining the standard. Just to put a fine point on it, there's two standards of objectivity, and I think there's a lot of talking past each other. The stated hope of the Bork Revolution is a seeking of objectivity, but it's objectivity within the economic domain, which is totally different than clarity and legibility, or we might think of as objectivity in the legal realm. And so once you have a domination of law, sometimes there's experts, sometimes there's not. Look, we didn't talk about it because we all know it. Judges are a problem here. But part of what I was trying to show is that judges are going to continue to enable the primacy of economics in some realms of the domain, but rulemaking puts law as the sort of primary domain in other realms. State inaction of abusive dominance laws puts the primacy in other realms. State rulemaking under unfair methods of competition, state, which hasn't happened yet, but I'm excited about, under state statutes, which grant AGs authority to do that on non-competes, that puts authority in the legal realm. The state laws that are passed on non-compete. So the more that you sort of surround the realm with law-like law domain, then the role of judges still critically important. Like, don't deny that, but the role of judges retreats. And the thing that is different about this area than anti-corruption is that although there's a judicial problem, it's not a constitutional judicial problem as of yet. And that creates far more room for the reassertion of law and the reassertion of politics than in anti-corruption, where the reassertion of law and politics run up against a constitutional First Amendment barrier.
Thank you. Barry, I'm going to pin a phrase that was used by not just you, but I think Cristina and Matt in other ways as well, which is independent business or the small businessman. And so to be provocative, is it the case that the small businessman or the small woman or the independent business is comfortably part of the same class formation as the worker? Is there not actually antagonism between the petit bourgeois and the worker? And the fact that often small businesses are the ones that pay the lowest wages. You know, the Urban Institute had this study in 2007 that most workers who earn low wages tend to work for smaller businesses. And so, I mean, do we, as kind of folks committed to empowering the downtrodden or the weak, should we see, worker, farmer, independent business as this coherent and non-antagonistic relationship formation?
Well, there's obviously there's going to be conflict any place where you have a boss and then you have employees, right? That's just kind of normal. So but the thing is, I'm going to keep it brief, but like one thing, imagine there's a town somewhere in America and they have 10 stores. There's a grocer and there's a garage and there's a gas station and a McDonald's, and there's 10 different places where I can go sell my work. Walmart comes in and provides all that work. They even take the McDonald's and put it inside the Walmart. And actually, I doubt that many people in this room have shopped at Walmart, but there's usually a McDonald's inside the Walmart. And so suddenly, if you are a worker in that town, where can you sell your labor? There's one buyer. So this is not really necessarily a class issue. This is a power issue and a structure issue. So workers, and this is something that workers over the years have understood. Actually, the American traditional Republican, the small R Republican, small R Republican workers movement in this country was radically anti-monopoly. So, and then when it comes to who pays lower wages, just, go back to 2007. I remember that study. And Monopoly was paying lower wages. Walmart was paying lower wages than most of those corporations. So after they had monopolized retail within this town or that town, then they drove the prices down because everybody was dependent on them. So, I think it's pretty easy to make the case that workers and independent businesses can rise together. And actually, there's a lot of analysis on our website that'll show you that. But a couple other things, just, two things about, the last question you asked of Zephyr. You should watch Jonathan Cantor's discussion at Christina's event in January 31 in Brussels, he speaks only about language. He talks about how, when he goes to court, he talks about democracy. He talks about human liberty. He talks about justice. He talks about abuse of the individual business person, the individual worker. And he talks about the threat that when Bertelsmann is going to take over Simon & Schuster, the threat this poses to our democracy, to freedom of speech. And you know what happens when, as he says, he goes, it's much more likely to win that case than if he walks in there and talks about pennies on the dollar.
Matt, you mentioned the fact that antitrust is really, you called it an ideology or a worldview. And, but you also said, there are other problems in the economy, like arbitration abuse you mentioned, or surveillance and so on, that aren't necessarily problems to be solved by antitrust, but the antitrust mentality brings a set of toolkit and a worldview to bear on those as well. Can you kind of draw that out of what you mean by that?
Yeah, I guess I could. I'm trying to think of a good story that will kind of bring it through, but I can't think of one. Sorry. Antitrust is not an ideology. Antitrust is just a body of law. What I think what Bork was saying is that the way antitrust was being pursued represented a certain ideological framework, and that that was kind of like the beating heart or the spark plug or something of the of governance around political economy. And so when I was going through archives, you would see regulators who would, at the FCC or other places, who would say, "Oh, this is a problem having to do with tying," or they would use language that clearly came from their understanding of antitrust. Like, people knew antitrust laws, particularly the mid-century framing, right, the Brandeisian framing, and they use that in governance across the board. They also passed laws around. For instance, there's unfair methods of competition statutes, like, kind of tossed across a whole bunch of different agencies, and people knew why, and they used them. And now it's like there's one at the USDA, but nobody there kind of remembers what it's for. And that's, the DOT, they were very hostile to using their unfair methods of competition policymaking, because they're like, well, we don't do that. That's not us, right? And so that's just like a success. That's Bork's success of changing what antitrust meant. And so the way you would, I guess the second part of your question is, how do you bring that back? And the answer, I think, is what the agencies are doing, which is to sort of articulate and bring back concepts like fairness. I think fairness is such an important way to talk about the law, because it's, first of all, it's in statute, right? And so you can be like, oh, it's all flabby, who knows what it is? It's like, well, Congress wrote it in law, so deal with it. But also, I think it distinguishes, so the sort of the law and economics side, a lot of conservatives don't like it because they think it's flabby, but I think a lot of people on the left don't like it because they prefer charity. And fairness is not charity. And so really articulating what fairness is and giving legal doctrine, which I think the FTC has done. They've done it on competition, but I think they've actually been more aggressive and successful on consumer protection and privacy. It really, I think it's kind of spreading. That ideological notion spreads as people get more training. I guess I'll just finish by saying I gave a lecture. I gave a talk to a bunch of national security people who were freaking out because everything costs more and they get less budget or not as much budget as they used to. And this is sort of the only answer that made sense to them. Why are they spending more and getting less? And everyone's like, oh, it's just a bummer, man. That's life. And that's true. You go into any room in America, healthcare policy or corporate, and people are getting less and spending more. And this is an actual answer. And if you can articulate that, people can use it in their own ways. And so I think it's kind of like a proselytizing mission in many ways.
Cristina, last question for you before we open it up. To go back to your final point about the tension potentially between antitrust and industrial policy, which of course is something that's present in the U.S. context as well. How do you think through that tension, right? In other words, like, especially if we want a Europe that can compete in a kind of larger global context, is there not a case to be made for being more lax on industrial on antitrust if it means, for example, supporting increasing returns to scale and so on?
There's a big discussion to be had, no question, and a discussion that needs to happen in Europe urgently. But I think that it's received wisdom that we cannot go back to a view of national champions and supporting scale per se. The difficulty is going to be how to make those two things compatible. I am very partial, as I think I said before, to the notion that in a way the value that antitrust brings is to be a principle that can be infused through multiple areas of policy. And trade is one, as we heard before. Catherine Tyre very much embodies this. Industrial policy is another. One needs to think about how do we make the need for scale compatible with things we know from the literature. We know that studies show us that the consolidating telecoms inside a country leads to higher prices. This is objective evidence. Tommaso's worked on this, and it doesn't increase investment. There is a call for it. At the same time, I wish I will not see the European regulators doing the usual sort of, we know what we're doing, we don't need to change anything because everything we do is right. We pursue the process of competition. We don't need to engage with this. This industrial policy stuff is all crazy and we don't need to go there because we need to go there at some level. So I think that there needs to be a discussion and I hope people will come out and play. And that, let me say this because it is my pet subject and I need to just leave this room with this thing being said. The obsession that Europe at the moment and the amount of calories that Europe is spending on the Digital Markets Act and its enforcement is mind-boggling. You will have a panel tomorrow morning. Unfortunately, I cannot be there, so I need to get my point out today. This isn't to say that this isn't a great act of democracy, that we were able to pass a law and this is great and we should just be commended and congratulate ourselves, no end. But the point is that it is also hard to see the way in which, for example, academia is clapping constantly the regulators for this. It is a groupist kind of session in which everybody says, isn't that marvelous? We will tame big tech. And frankly, big tech doesn't know it's being tamed. Somebody should break it to them because it isn't happening that way. And the reason it isn't happening that way is that the law is a great valiant effort. There is a question of resources. But if you are really looking at marginally inducing some change, yes, the law can do that, and with time, we'll get there. If you're thinking about anything that has any chance of dispersing power, that law is not capable of doing any such thing. In addition to which, and I conclude on this, there is the crazy process of implementation, which is one in which we deluded ourselves in Europe that we have this law, it's going to be self-executing. What does it mean? That the gatekeepers will read it and instantly know what they need to do. And so they read it and see, what does it mean? And the commission and the regulators say, well, figure it out, right? Comply. Well, what do you mean? What do I have to actually do? Well, it's written, comply. Well, I don't understand it. Well, it's up to you. It's up to you. Well, it's dumb. It's up to you. You just give us a proposal and then we tell you if you don't comply. But tell me how I comply. No, we won't tell you that. We'll tell you if you don't comply. So this kind of thing is not going to be very conducive to any results because there is going to be a process that's going to be elongated and we go to court for the next 10 years. So I think that while it is a jolly good thing and I commend the people who are putting a lot of effort into it, Europe cannot be putting all its eggs in the basket of digital regulation. We are not going to come out of it alive. It's not going to put points on GDP. What is it doing? We need to really do other stuff in addition to it. I'll leave it there. I'm very popular in Europe at this point.
Thank you. Yes, Tim.
Wait to the light. Thank you. I very much appreciate this panel. And I think that the topic of beginning to think of what's been going on in the last 3 years is a very important one. My question is kind of comment-like question is really for Zephyr and for Matt. Zephyr, you were talking about the main change attempt to inject a more legal, shift the paradigm to more legal paradigm. I think that has been true and very important. I want to say that from the perspective of the White House, that was one thing we wanted to do. Another thing we wanted to try to make happen was to have antitrust policy understood as economic policy, period. So it's another kind of step. And therefore, and at some level, macroeconomic policy. In the same sense, we were thinking that we spend so much time thinking about, our fiscal policy, monetary policy, all these other things and how they're doing, and it seems like a big public concern, something that the president could talk about. Similarly, the structure of the economy is something that has a big effect on everybody. And, we don't just, and that it makes sense for us to be talking about a concern, be a subject of debate. So I'm sort of asking whether you think that is a good idea or whether it's been successful. And my question for Matt is related. One of the things we thought, we agreed that there's a lot of fair competition powers inside the various agencies, and agreed that just having it being narrow is not very successful. So that's the reason for the Competition Council and having the White House involved, was trying to, as opposed to hope the agencies would by themselves realize that they have these authorities, tell them they have their authorities and tell them what to do with it. So I think that, I don't know if we fully succeeded in that sort of an ongoing mission. This is sounding more like a comment than a question, but I wonder if you think that what that will take to be really successful. Maybe that's how I'll put it.
So I actually have that next on my list, right, of domain changes. It's law, politics, industrial policy. And I think it's critical to move it to macro policy. I think it's actually, if you just move it to law, and even just move it to law and policy, it still doesn't have the same traction. And that there's an exciting tension when you go macro, right? And this, I'm just going to speak just about politics, not about the underlying merits. I'm really excited about your project of thinking about industrial policy and anti-monopoly. But one is, I have been thinking a lot recently about the futurelessness that sort of pervades a lot of people's lives. Just an absence of the sense of future. Like they know there's going to be a future, but they actually feel like there's. And your conversation with Fiona was so exciting because it really brought together the way in which it's an industrial policy that has uncertainty within it, but that uncertainty is not a negative uncertainty, right? It is an industrial policy that is grounded in finding a role for people to be participants in their own future. And so I don't think Biden is there yet on communicating it, but that it's the sort of a spiritual quality in a way of antitrust as engaging people's own future. And then there's intention with that, which is the other exciting political part, is the agon, the fight with the big guys, right? And that is much more like the anti-part of antitrust, like take them on. I think that tension is a productive one. I don't think it's a negative one. But I think there are two very big political areas where Biden has done you guys have done the groundwork in extraordinary ways. But I don't know that we quite have that feeling of a future and a fight that can come with a macro antitrust policy.
Matt, the second half of the question.
Yes,
Yeah, so the way I think about the EO and the work that you've done, which was extraordinarily impressive, is that it's creating a new faction, a new political faction and then try to kind of expand the remit of that. And I think the best story I have with this is that a lot of EOs are long and dumb and don't do anything. And the competition EO was really successful because there was a clear point to it. And the way you could tell the success, I think the success that I saw was, and this is a story that Dave Dayan told me about, and then I looked it up. There was an employee from the Forestry Service who said, there's only one company that makes aerial retardants for forest fires, right? When your plane flies over and drops stuff and it's expensive and it's bad and it's not good for the environment. There's this other company that is making stuff that's cheaper and better and more environmentally sustainable. And we regulate this area. And we only have one company on our list of companies that are validated to do this. Why don't we add this other company and also start buying from them? And the reason we're going to do that is because of this executive order for competition, right? So EOs, you can tell agencies what to do, but you also have this kind of bottom-up thing within government. I think you've seen some of that. I see DOD reports coming out, and they're like, we're writing this report because of the executive order. So it gives an excuse to people that want to do this, which is really, which is pretty amazing to see. There are people who believe in the anti-monopoly framework, and they are using it as a tool. But one of the things I think you also see where it's not failed, because I don't think the point was to sort of articulate a position, but you see a lot of conflicts within agencies. And you see two things. Conflicts within agencies, because a lot of people don't think it's their job and they don't necessarily want to change. And there's this tendency that a lot of people have when they get into an agency to run it on a political level. They want to be mayor of the agency. They don't want to create any conflict. And that inhibits you when you're trying to make structural change. But the other thing that you see, and I think this particularly hit HHS pretty bad and the Center for Medicare and Medicaid, is that you have people who are in charge of these agencies that are basically public utility agencies. Like CMS regulates healthcare. It's a public utility agency, but they think of themselves as welfare, like social welfare agents. So they just want to pour more money into things to get more access, and they don't realize they're actually regulating utilities. And that's where you've seen a failure, not a failure of the executive order, but sometimes you just don't have the right people who have the right philosophy in a lot of the positions of power. But I think of this maybe not as the first draft, because the first draft was in the Obama administration, but it made the second draft, and there will be a third draft and a fourth draft, and there are more and more people learning about what it means to govern in this specific way.
I can add a comment. I think in the long run, we may look back and see the biggest success of this was actually Thai and trade policy and also your national security people getting on board. And our biggest failure was clearly healthcare, but they wouldn't do anything to COVID did.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I moved that.
Other questions over here in the middle?
Hi, I thought this was a terrific panel. I'm going to make a quick advertisement. Barry helped to spur that there's a book out there that some of you may have picked up, I think, if you're panelists, called Antimonopoly in American Democracy. And this is a Tobin Project volume to try to tell the history of anti-monopoly forward from, well, certainly the 18th century up to the present. Richard White's essay contends that anti-monopoly was the most important political movement of the 1870s and 1880s. So in a way, the end of the beginning of the anti-monopoly movement, there was an anti-monopoly movement before. And then the two things I wanted to say, substantively questions. A central component of 19th century anti-monopoly concerned land. And you've heard me on this before. And it's explicitly hostile to efficiency. It's explicitly concerned with dignity. And there are clear ties back, and I was delighted to hear the 17th century levelers brought up. And that has national parks comes out of that. It's not just Labor Day coming out of the labor movement, which is an anti-monopoly movement. There's a lot of concern about land, resources, utility. And I've been thinking about this with language, and the question is this. We've got at least one historian in the group. There are philosophers who are working in this area. I'm thinking here of Elizabeth Anderson, whose Private Government is a wonderful book that takes us back to the levelers, explicitly framed around the concept of monopoly. And she makes, I think, the provocative claim that worked with about half of my students and got the other half very agitated in a positive way, that the corporations today are not just networks or not just Goliaths, but they're communists in their relationship with the workforce. And if we're going forward with young people who are not notably enthusiastic about capitalism, as I can tell you from teaching them, the Elizabeth Anderson framing, which you may not all know about, so it's kind of unfair, but I think that's a helpful one. And I would also land, natural resources, sustainability, which we haven't heard much about. Those are all issues that are of concern to young people today. So I want to commend Barry. And I'm asking again, what about land, natural resources? And I'll ask Matt, we talked about it privately, what about public utility model? The anti-monopoly movement, 1900, 1912, was focused not around the Sherman Act, but it was focused around the cities and municipal utilities. Sherman Act was widely regarded as a failure. I'd contend it was not regarded as a success by core elites really until after Thurman Arnold, but the municipal ownership movement and the land reform movement are key 19th century anti-monopoly triumphs that are of interest to 21st century young people, and that's the future. And the kids are all right, and we got to meet them halfway.
Yeah, I'll throw another one at you, which is from Du Bois, from Black Reconstruction, which is land, light, and liberty, and land. We have to remember that there's, you brought up conservation of land, but land in the American tradition, going back to the first Homestead Act, which was in 1789 with the Northwest Ordinance. The point was to make people independent, right? It was the individual should be absolutely independent, because there's the benefit of having human liberty, but it's also, this is the only pathway to democracy. People who wanted true popular democracy, they had to figure out a way of creating people that were fully independent of other people. And you and I have talked about this many times, about the dangers, the perceived dangers of dependency. But why is Du Bois' idea important? Land, light, and liberty. Also, it's like the purpose of this, it's not just material. It's not just so that we are materially independent. It's so that we are spiritually independent, so that we can actually worship the God we want, so that we can dream the dreams we want, so that when we wake up, we can actually engage, create the communities we want with the people we want, think the thoughts that we want to think with who we want to think them, and not be controlled by a blue line on the map, not be controlled by, Google telling me who to talk to. I mean, Facebook telling me who to listen to. So it was about spiritual and intellectual liberty, fundamentally, and land in the Northwest Ordinance 1789.
Just to get to your, just to bring that up to just for a couple of policy fights that I think hit very clearly on what you're talking about. So, first of all, housing prices. Really can't find a place, really expensive, and a lot of talk about corporate ownership of housing. The governor of Texas, not a liberal, was talking about it. Interestingly, the Hart-Scott-Rodino merger notification procedure excludes real estate acquisitions. Chinese purchase of farmland is a big political issue. Rent fixing prices. So there's an antitrust case on rent fixing. And then I think the big one where we're really going to see the sustainability conversation really like you have to deal with it. You can't just be like, oh, I don't want to deal with climate change, is flood insurance and homeowner insurance, which is so expensive and going crazy. And like, that's where the wealth of so many people is locked up in, and they increasingly can't, like there are companies that are pulling out of Florida, pulling out of California. And there's going to have to be a conversation about what to do and how to finance that. So I think that's where you can link the historical framing that you're talking about, Henry George, Northwest Ordinance, so on and so forth, to modern policy debates.
George's, your occupation believes in innovation, but these late 19th century folks are either indifferent to or hostile to efficiency. And the way to make that point is the bonanza farms. That was anathema, the big farms in Minnesota. The reformers, anti-monopolists will look at those big farms and they'll say, this is terrible. Of course it's cheap wheat for Europe, but you've got no schools, you've got no churches, you've got no local communities. Those bonanza farms are a disaster. And you go to Henry George, by far the most popular political economist of the late 19th century, influenced economic policy in Australia, New Zealand, in Britain, in Israel, as well as in the United States, key figure in the progressive era. He is not interested in efficiency, it's dignity.
And with that, I'm getting signals that we've got to move on to the next thing. So thank you again. Thanks to the panelists.